range. I appreciate what Mr. Rowe had brought up about maybe we should differentiate between the different, commercial versus multifamily versus single family homes and have those different tiers. So I'm glad that was all brought up because that was what I was going to add. But also talking with this gentleman in line, he's actually always saying that batteries are going to be out. Technology is going to really make some batteries obsolete very quickly. And so I do think that after hearing what I was talking to him about and some of the investments he's making, that I want to make sure that we have those spots available, but it might be a different technology very quickly. So I'm glad we're having this conversation. Thank you.
Commissioner Cho, followed by Commissioner Doherty.
Yeah, I like Patrick's idea of tailoring it to the uses that are just more likely to use them, like office uses. I think that makes the most sense. I don't think it's very valuable, and I think I said this previously, if to have this in front of a Wendy's when someone's going in for 4 minutes, it's just not even going to be worth it for them to connect. I think 30 is totally reasonable. And, the one thing I would say is, and I agree with John that this, 240, I mean, when I did the electric in my house and rewired my house, I had a 240 outlet put into my garage for this purpose. But the, technology could change. And personally, I think that it could very well be that we don't have charging stations ever because all of our gas stations eventually just turn into battery swap stations. And that's how the technology will go. I'm not predicting that. I'm saying it's one way that could very well happen. And it would demonstrate that all of our efforts here are for naught. Now, it definitely could happen the other way, but that's why I would think EV ready is appropriate because it decreases the cost by doing the work ahead of time without requiring those extra amounts. So I would recommend, 30 parking spaces, use specific office and the like, and they should be EV ready is what I would recommend. And then the other question I was going to ask of the maps is when would this, can you remind me, I don't recall from our prior discussion, when this requirement would kick in? So it's, you got an existing property with an existing parking lot, existing building, and it's a new business that comes in with, you tell me when they would have to the cash to make this change.
I think those are good points there, Commissioner Choate. I think that if it's existing, we'll have to really wrestle with that. And maybe that's something that we further have Mr. Goebel and them help us with to identify that maybe in an existing scenario, if they're only doing a percentage of expansion, then it doesn't qualify. But if they go over a certain capacity of expansion, then it kicks in. So we'll look at that. Commissioner Doherty.
Thanks, Matt. I was doing a little bit of research while we were talking here, and I found a page or a webinar from the US EPA State and Local Energy and Environment webinar series. I sent the link out just a moment ago. As I mentioned when I spoke a minute ago, I too am looking for sticking with the 30 versus the 50, requirement, but I'd like to make sure of a couple of things. First of all, I'd like to make sure that we have the terms EV ready and EV capable correct as per the EPA. The EPA has those flipped, where EV capable does not yet have electricity in it, but EV ready does have a 240 volt outlet in it. So I'd like to make sure we've got that correct. The other piece, and the reason that I was making the comment about wanting to have the conduits, et cetera, in place is backed up on the 24th page of this presentation, with EV capable, as per the EPA, EV capable parking spaces installed during new construction, it saves between $2,040 and $4,635 per parking space over having to retrofit. So that's really why I'm all for putting in the conduit. But again, when we're talking dollars that high, is there a way that we could possibly incentivize developers to input more than the 30 required parking, or the 1 unit per 30 parking spaces, maybe offering them a little higher density in a parking lot in a smaller space, or a little less in the way of treed area or things along those lines, if they were to go ahead and put in a higher than required number of EV capable parking spaces?
Point.
I can jump in there real quick, Matt. There is a variety of incentives that communities are exploring to get even higher rates of participation with these spaces. And we can pass that information on to staff in the background. A lot of them have been able to tap into large pots of money that have been set aside for energy enhancements, things like that. You know, when Volkswagen had their problems and they had to create that big pot of money basically to contribute towards sustainability, a lot of communities that have been authorized to tap into that fund have used that to provide rebates for installation of these chargers. So there's a lot of creativity that's going on there, and we've got a spreadsheet, and we can pass that on to staff just to give them some creative ideas and examples.
Okay, well, I think that we got kind of some universal direction on that we should be working around the number 30 and maybe making sure we get right definitions, and that we consider use types as some other way of potentially helping us to manage where these go. Of course, there's the whole urban rural discussion too. So that gives us some good direction to work on for our final edits before we come to you at a public hearing with these amendments in probably September.
And Gabby, if we could go back 2 slides. So just as a reminder now, the next steps on the development standards will be the posting of the draft regulations. So we'll do some fine tuning on this text based on the feedback tonight, and then post the draft regulations, which will be the adoption draft. And then you will, like Matt said, you'll be seeing this in September or October. And I think there's some further discussion about when the actual meeting dates for this are going to be, September versus October. Matt or Leslie, I don't know if you guys wanted to weigh in on that right now.
Yeah, I think that at the terminus of tonight's meeting, we're going to talk a little bit about meeting dates coming up next month. We have some special requests, and we'll talk about those then. So now we'll just leave it to be discussed later.
Okay.
Thank you, Matt.
So the next 2 updates are going to be quicker. There's no real new meat to introduce. Like I said, we're splitting apart RV campgrounds and housing, so those can move forward on independent tracks if necessary. And I'll jump ahead to the next steps on August 27th. It is going to be the posting of the regulations, and then again we're going to talk about the meeting dates in September or October. I'm not the best one to talk about the changes that have been made substantively based on the feedback. I'm not sure if that's Jen or Gabby. What do you guys want to weigh in on that first bullet?
Yeah, we're just, from what we've heard from particularly the owners of RV parks and campgrounds, is just to do a little bit more thinking about or discussing long-term occupancy limitations in campgrounds, as well as just sort of double checking that we got the density and design standards correct for both of those. But otherwise, there's no significant edits there.
Yeah, they're really tailored towards the state standards,
Right.
making them more current.
Yeah. And then, so I can just take this housing update. So we have the housing survey out right now. And so the results are pending, and based on doing a review of the responses we got there. We'll probably have some relevant edits incorporated. But sort of the biggest topic in housing is the accessory living area, the accessory dwelling unit standards, where those should be allowed and by what type of review. And then also just kind of the general size design standards that go along with those. Otherwise, the other topics like tiny houses on wheels, manufactured homes, that again is just some fine tuning and making sure we got it right. And so this topic is on kind of the extended track compared to the other topics. So that way we can get those survey results and really take some time to incorporate them. So that draft is going to be ready at the end of September with the hearings planned for October currently.
Commissioner Choate, you had a comment?
There we go. Just a question. Are we going to have an opportunity to discuss those again at work session prior to the adoption draft going up at the end of September and our public hearings in October?
I just made a note of that, Commissioner Choate. And look at our schedule. And it might be helpful to have a work session. We can talk.
Your volume's real low, Jim.
Sorry, I just noted that I made a note that potentially it would be a good idea to have a work session on the housing standards before we bring it back for adoption.
I just know that we had a lot of really good discussion on that, and it sounds like there's going to be some somewhat substantive suggested changes after our discussion as a result of the input. So thank you.
So given the schedule that we're going to talk about towards the end of tonight's meeting, there's going to be some suggested dates of moving around some things. And it may be that we ask you to make more comments via information that we sent to you rather than to have an actual work session on it. But we'll discuss that a little bit more at the end of tonight's meeting. All right. Anything else, Gabby, that you would like to add?
Nope, not for updates.
Okay, good. Good. I think that covers the updates. We just wanted to give you an idea where we were on those subjects, and then we'll try to get back with you or to let you know when we do post information out there, so that maybe you can take a look at it as well. And so having completed that, our actual discussion items tonight are urban ag and the keeping of livestock, and then 1041. So Matt and Gabby, I believe that you guys are going to help us with urban ag and the keeping of livestock. If you want to go ahead and start your presentation.
Thanks, Matt. So there are 4 main topics related to urban ag and livestock, and those are general agriculture use specific standards, which is a recent addition to this group of updates that you all have not heard about before, poultry related uses, farm stands, and livestock classification and animal unit systems. So just to start, as a reminder of the trajectory of this topic, we do have a virtual open house for the draft regulations that you all had for this work session. And that is next week. And then we plan to turn around the adoption draft pretty quickly after that, posting at the end of August, and then coming to hearing in September or October. So general agriculture use specific standards. This is a new topic for discussion that resulted from both our work during phase 1, as well as our conversations around some of these other subtopics like poultry related uses and how the county can best ensure that impacts are mitigated while still encouraging agricultural uses, especially in the more urban areas. So as such, we drafted a few new standards. that are applicable to all principal and all accessory agricultural uses. And if you remember in the use table, those are each in their own specific section of, in the principal, there's agriculture uses, and then in the accessory table, there's also agriculture uses. So anything listed under those two sections would need to meet these standards. And so there's a basic standard that each property or use is required to meet some general best management practices. And those are related to things like water quality, the management of the actual property with manure and dust and potential odors, pests, wildlife, and weeds. And then they also address some general operational standards for the uses to ensure things like proper site drainage, adequate composting and disposal of refuse, and then as well to mitigate things like the visual impacts of outdoor storage area. And so something that, as you read these standards, that we would like feedback on is if there are any additional standards that should be applied to all agricultural uses across the board to make sure that we are mitigating impacts as needed. And then the next topic is poultry. And before we got into kind of the specifics of things, we just wanted to walk through the poultry related use definitions because it's really easy to get confused about which is which and what we're talking about. So first is just the basic definition of poultry. And then next, the backyard poultry use is the non-commercial raising and caring for poultry. There's no on-site processing with backyard poultry uses. And then moving up in intensity, there's poultry and egg production, and that's further separated into small and large operations based on maximum numbers of birds. And poultry and egg production is meant to be more of the commercial egg production and sale of poultry, and on-site processing is allowed. And then finally, the most intense use, which isn't really included in your draft, but we just want you to be aware of, is that there's the custom meat and poultry processing. And, you know, that's the most intense use and where the poultry is not necessarily raised on or kept on the site. So all of those terms can get really confused. So that's that distinction. I can't see if anyone is raising hands. So Matt Lafferty, you're gonna have to help me here, chime in if anyone has their hands raised.
Commissioner Doherty has his hand raised.
Okay, thank you.
Should we put a comment in under backyard poultry that states no processing of poultry? The reason I ask is quite often around the county, I see smaller lots, parcels, half an acre, quarter of an acre, whatever it may be, that has an egg box out front, and you can, on the honor system, grab some eggs and leave some money, which could be considered commercial or it might not be considered commercial. But I think probably the biggest thing we don't want, let me rephrase that, the neighbors probably wouldn't want in backyard poultry on those smaller parcels would be the actual process of the birds.
Commissioner Doherty, on page 17 of your packet, there was some suggested language, and in there, it does talk to that point. Processing is not something that we would like to see as part of a backyard operation, or, you know, backyard chicken keeping or poultry keeping. And eggs, though, are kind of a little bit different. And we saw that was an opportunity to use our home occupation regulations to say, if you're going to have chickens, let's say up to 50 and whatnot, which is shown here as a potential, and you produce eggs, then you could call yourself a home occupation and you would live with the vehicular trip limits and those types of things associated with a home occupation, so that it doesn't get overwhelming on the neighborhood.
Appreciate it. I must have read right over that. Sorry about that.
And Gabby was going to probably present it. So sorry, Gabby.
You're fine.
Commissioner Wallace and then Commissioner Barrick.
My observation with respect to this issue is if you don't allow a homeowner who has a flock of a dozen chickens to butcher the chickens when the chickens have reached the age of 2 or 3, then you're really taking away some of the advantages of doing backyard poultry. And I know it says on-site processing is prohibited, but I mean, I've had like 10 or 12 chickens always, and maybe 20 or 25. And I think to myself, every time I do something with those chickens, that they ought to be eaten. If you're gonna grow them, you should eat them when you get finished with them. Otherwise, what are you gonna do? Throw them out in the back pasture and let the coyotes get to them? You're gonna wrap them up in a sack and put them in the landfill? I have that issue with respect to the on-site processing prohibited. I don't think you're doing it for money and you're not doing it for anything else, but you're trying to make the best use of an animal that you can, and they get old, and then what happens to them? They just die and you dig a hole for them? I don't know what the answer is, but that's my thought over the last 25 years of having a flock of a dozen or 2 chickens.
Okay, good points. Thank you. Commissioner Barrick.
Yeah, to follow on to Commissioner Wallace's comment around that, you know, if based on their parcel size, they're able to have up to 100 birds, then that's kind of a lot of processing. And I think about in the last year or two during COVID times, there have been some surveys with small and mid-sized meat producers on the Front Range. And one of the biggest gaps for them as a business and for their product is the processing, the ability to process, and their access to small meat processing opportunities. So I guess I'm looking at page 15 of the board packet, and I know this isn't related to the backyard use, but under poultry and egg production, on-site processing shall occur in an enclosed structure. I would recommend adding language around mobile processing units and whether those are allowable in there.
Okay. Thanks. And I think that was the point of Gabby early, was to point out that there's the backyard component, which if you look at the current numbers that we use, our backyard regulations right now say you can have 6 backyard chickens. That's all. That's where it drops. It drops at 6. There are no latitudes to move beyond that. The city of Fort Collins allows 8. So we thought about elevating to correspond with 8. And so in thinking about that in urbanized areas like Fort Collins or Loveland or, you know, Windsor, places like that, the idea was on some research that I conducted that if you have 8 birds, the suggested area allowance for a bird for their coop was 3 square feet. It was actually 2 to 4, and it depends upon the size of the bird. So bigger birds might have a larger area. So 8 birds in a coop should have approximately 24 square feet of area, plus the area where you can gather eggs up and whatnot. And then the outdoor run, which is generally a caged in area to keep wildlife out of, was said a suggestion of 12 to 20 square feet per animal, and we landed on 15. And so looking at that, if you had a 5,000 square foot lot, which is a very common urban lot these days, that would put you right around 8 birds. If you used 3% of the property devoted to the bird's coop and run. And so that gives the bird adequate space, still leaves room for people to have a small yard. And hopefully, and we might add some setbacks in here because, you know, you don't want to just put it right up against your neighbor's fence. Some of those things to make sure that we have compatibility issues. And then, so you say, well, where does 50 come from? Well, in the urban area, you may have larger lots, and I've seen lots that get up to 2-3 acres. And so if your lot is a larger lot, and you can accommodate a larger pen and coop and run area, then you should correspondingly be allowed to have a large number of birds. But we didn't think that the number should rise above 50 in the urbanized areas, and that it shouldn't go over 100 in the rural areas for backyard chickens. If you want to be something other than a backyard chicken type of an arrangement, then it would rise to the next level of definitions, and then there may be an approval process that has to be considered. Comments, anything? Okay, Commissioner Wallace, did you have more to say? Your hand's still raised. Okay, thank you. All right, Gabby, do you want to continue with your presentation on this?
Matt, this is
Commissioner
Jen Johnson. I did have a question, but sorry, my hand, it is raised, but are we just talking about backyard poultry right now, or are we also talking about the agriculture section? Because we went over that one really quickly, and I do have a question on that if this is an appropriate time.
Let's let Gabby hit the high points on those, and then we'll come back to questions.
Okay. So we've kind of addressed some of these things or alluded to them, but so the poultry and egg production, which is the next and more intense use. First thing to note is that where it is allowed, either an administrative special review or a special review is required. Smaller operations, which have that maximum of 200 birds, require administrative special review, and then the large, which are over 200, require special review. And the intent of that is knowing that there is on-site processing, being able to really make sure that the standards are being, or that the impacts are being addressed. So then there are new use-specific standards for poultry and egg production. They have the same matching coop and outdoor run enclosure size requirements that backyard poultry did. So with that same background of why we chose those numbers and what those numbers are based on. There's general maintenance requirements. The processing is required to occur in an enclosed structure. And then any outdoor activities must be set back 150 feet from the property lines. So I'll just keep moving through this and we can come back to whatever we need to come back to. So the next bigger topic is farm stands. And so as you all know from prior discussions, House Bill 191191 requires that farm stands of any size be permitted on any size parcel, regardless of whether the site has been zoned for agricultural operations. So we've updated it to be an allowed accessory use in all zoning districts. And then although farm stands do still have to be located on a property that maintains a principal agricultural use, the new standards do allow for the sale of agricultural products from any other property that is also a principal agriculture use. It used to be that only the products created on that property could be sold. But so this is sort of opening up that flexibility and allowing for other agricultural producers to come use somebody else's farm stand to sell their agricultural products. There used to be a 200 square foot size limitation that's been removed based on that House bill. And then also, and we added a new parking standard and that requires 1 parking space per 200 square feet of farm stand. And it must be located on the same side of the street and within 50 feet of the farm stand. And the intent of that was for safety purposes, to make sure there wasn't a lot of foot traffic attempting to cross busy roads, and to make sure that the impact of the farm stand really stayed in one area near that farm stand. And then finally, livestock and the keeping of animals. So in the current LUC, some species have limits based on specific animal related uses like the backyard poultry. that we've been talking about, equestrian operations, feedlots. But generally, the county wants to avoid a strict regulation of the number of animals on a property at any given time. So long as there's not negative impacts to the neighborhood, that's really what the county is concerned with. So as such, the proposed approach is to maintain a document outside of the code that provides a suggested amount of livestock based on an animal unit system. And so this was in the cover memo of the packet. It was not in the code, obviously. And so this is a proposed animal unit system. It was informed by Weld and Boulder County's systems. And this is tailored by character area. So as you can see in the conservation and agricultural area, that's characterized by much larger and more rural lots and more agricultural uses in general. That allows for more animal units per acre. And then it decreases in scale from there as you move into the more urban areas. And then the table on the right shows the equivalency system for the number of animals that make up one animal unit. So if we look at this, 1 horse is considered the same impact as 2 alpaca. And again, this system was informed by those other county standards. And it is recommended to stay outside of the code and used as more of a tool for staff when they receive questions or when reviewing applications for agricultural uses involving the keeping of animals and livestock. So that was everything. So now we can open it up to go back to any of the topics, whoever may have questions. Happy to answer.
Commissioner Cho.
I have a particular question on this one and then a more general question. The particular question is, you say it was informed by, the neighboring counties. Being familiar with Weld, I think one head of cattle per acre is pretty darn low. Where did that number come from?
So I would need to, I don't know that answer off the top of my head. I would need to look at if that was a Boulder County and more informed number.
I think
Okay.
it would be three per acre, because you're in an ag district and you'd have 1 per unit and 3 units per acre. So that's 3 per acre.
Depending
Oh,
upon-
right. It depends on where you're at of how that translates. Yes, thank you, Matt.
And we're talking about ag property.
I see what you're saying. I understand now. Thank you.
And then the other thing is that, the regulations that we currently have for horses, we allow 1 per half acre. So that would be 2 per acre. And so keeping the cattle consistent with the horse had some logic for us planners as well when we're trying to answer planner on call questions and look at applications.
We can just barely hear you, Jen. So I don't know if your mic's not
Sorry.
working or whatnot, but I think we get the gist that, there's things in the county like currently you're allowed, regardless of your location, to have 1 horse per half acre in the county. So that's 2 per acre. And that's for the keeping of those. And so maybe we need to look at the numbers a little closer based upon our standards and whatnot. But that's where, if you look at the table to the left, it says, there are different allowances for personal horse keeping than there is for just the general horse keeping if you're doing things. And to keep in mind, these aren't regulatory numbers. These are intended to be suggested numbers such that if we receive complaints from a property owner that so-and-so's got so many animals and and it smells and it's not properly managed and those types of things, and it's creating a nuisance in the neighborhood, then we got 2 tools available to us now. We can go back to those standards that Gabby was talking about very early on about maintaining your property and doing some of those things that we would like to see associated with property. And if those measures aren't sufficient enough to resolve that, and we can see that the person is over occupying their property, then we can use these numbers to make suggestions to them that it might be appropriate to move the number of animals on their property down to a smaller number in order to help mitigate some of the issues that are being witnessed by the area, neighbors in the area. And so think about them as tools. One of them, the standards or the design standards or the recommended standards for maintenance and stuff are more built into the code. They're things that we can use to help solve bigger problems. And then these livestock unit numbers are suggested numbers that help us to communicate with our residents about proper management techniques and how to maintain your property. And if you're overdoing it, how to move back down. They're just suggested numbers. They're not hard, fast numbers. Commissioner Kafalis and then Commissioner Johnson.
Thank you, Matt. I have a question specific to this topic and then a more general question, if I may. Will this proposed animal unit system address, for example, issues that have come up in the past where in the mountainous areas, a landowner has a certain number of yaks that seem to exceed the carrying capacity of the land that they're on, overgrazing, and then causing problems with runoff into the nearby creek. So if someone is exceeding these suggested limits, will this allow the county to help figure out some solutions to that?
That's the objective, Commissioner Kafalis. That would be the overall objective, is that these numbers are intended, if somebody's overgrazing their property or doing something and it's clearly based upon the number of animal units that they're providing, then it gives us the grounds to go talk to them about what's appropriate and maybe get them hooked up with cooperative extension services or other sources available to help them better manage their land. As far as some of the other issues that you talked about with maybe runoff and things going into creeks and whatnot, those standards that Gabby talked about early in her presentation, she may run back to them really quick, would suggest that we could talk to people, that we have best management practices built into our code that say, hey, if you're going to have animals and whatnot and you're adjacent to a creek, you need to help us understand what best management practices you're employing to make sure that water quality is not impacted and things like that. And these will be built more into the code than they will be into suggested recommendation numbers.
Thank you, Matt. That's helpful. And if I may follow up, and then I'll get to my general question. I don't see yaks listed. Would they be covered under other livestock in that first, where you talk about cattle? And where do yaks fit in? Because they're large animals and they clearly, more and more people are raising them and they do have an impact.
I think that Gabby can help me with this. I think that that's something that if you all believe that we need to be as inclusive as we can into this animal unit stable, then we could add more animals into there. I would think that the idea here was to make reference to animals that are somewhat typical, and then we can maybe have something that says or an equal. But is a yak equal to a horse, or is it equal to a llama? I think would be.
Actually, I think a yak would be equal to a cow or perhaps a buffalo, a bison. And but maybe you guys could give that some more thought.
Yes, great observation. Thank you.
Of course. And my question related to overall is, and I appreciate you going back to that previous slide on best management practices. Should we include or reference or encourage either in the land use code in the best management practices section, a reference to regenerative agriculture and related to that carbon sequestration, or perhaps should that be a policy kind of thing? But I'm wondering if folks think that that's an appropriate thing to We can't require it, but I think more and more farmers are moving in that direction. How do we encourage, incentivize regenerative farming and carbon sequestration? Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Falls. And I think it was Greg Schreiner that's really keyed in on that with the Ag Board. And maybe we could have a little more conversation with him.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. And of course, when we did that ag tour, we visited with his farm, and they are definitely keyed in on that. And it seems like as we go into the future, that's something we, at a minimum, need to incentivize or encourage with our agricultural operations. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Yes.
Commissioner Johnson, followed by Commissioner Rowe, and then Commissioner Barnett.
Thank you. So I have a couple questions. Gabby, if you could go back to that animal unit table, I have a couple suggestions. So a long time ago when I was in kindergarten, I was a Weld County planner. And I actually I was the one that added llamas and alpacas and ostriches and emus to the land use table. And I worked with the Cooperative Extension Agency, and these numbers were dealt with inputs. How much land do you need for an input? And then the output of the animals. And I think one of the things that could help clarify the table on the right is maybe instead of saying maximum allowed adult animals per animal unit, maybe just say animal unit equivalency for adult animals. Because that maximum allowed, it's hard to understand really what you're trying to say, because I think what you're wanting to say is one water buffalo is one animal unit. 5 goats is one animal unit. So I think what you're trying to do is animal unit equivalency on the table on the right, and then the table on the left, then you're taking that equivalency and putting with it how many animal units per acre in these different districts are going to be allowed. So I think the way it's written right now, I think you're so close, but I think you just need to clarify really what the intent is there, because it's a little confusing the way it's written now. And then my other question is on section 3.3.2. It's the agricultural intent, and then in subsection A.C under operational standards. So can you tell me what the intent of 2C is? And maybe, I mean, I can read it out loud or you can read it out loud, but I'm just wondering, how is this going to be applied? Is this going to be applied to existing agricultural practices? And what truly is the intent here? Because I just don't know how I feel about this.
So 2C is the outdoor storage standard. So first, your question about would it be applied to existing uses? These would be standards that are reviewed at the point of a development application. But it's also just a general maintenance standard. So if there were complaints received, reasonably staff could point to this saying that, you know, all agricultural uses are required to meet these standards. And really the intent of that is knowing that many agricultural uses do need outdoor storage. It's not prohibiting that because that's an important part of those operations. It's just to make sure that they're screened in a way that doesn't affect the neighboring properties and are maintained in a way that also don't affect neighboring properties or rights of way or any of those sort of surrounding areas. That's the intent. Okay, but if you think it's too overstepping, then if that's totally possible.
Commissioner Johnson?
Yes.
Maybe I could ask something on that too. I think I agree with you. I think screened is a little bit heavy. A lot of farmers will keep property, you know, keep an area where they keep old tractor equipment that they part off and they do things like that. And that's intended to be it. I think more or less what we would really like to be that they just keep it in an orderly fashion. And that if they have a neighboring property or owner or something, that they're mindful of, putting stuff right up against the fence that might cause nuisances or other disruptions between them. But a
Yeah.
screen is pretty hard, yes.
Yeah. So I want to read this out loud. So it says outdoor storage of equipment or other materials shall be screened from the public right of way and neighboring properties and maintained in an orderly manner with no trash, junk, or debris as defined by the county rubbish ordinance. I have no questions about the intent of adhering to compliance issues like the county rubbish ordinance and things like that, and not letting weeds grow or trash collect and things like that. But I mean, I'm not a farmer or a rancher, but I've been around that type of property enough in my life to know if I have a development moving in and I've been there first, and now I'm going to get complaints because I park my tractor wrong. I just think that this, the way it's written, it's really opening farm and ranch land, which we've determined in our comprehensive plan is very important to preserve. I think we're opening those individuals up to petty nuisance complaints that are based on not understanding how agricultural and ranch land operates. So I'm just raising that as a question to my fellow planning commissioners, people that may have more experience with farm and ranch land than I do. I'm just really concerned that this is setting a standard that all farmers and ranchers are now going to have to screen their work areas. And I'm just opening it up for anybody else that might have more experience than me.
Next up, and Ann, I'm sure they'll get to you on that question. Thanks, that was a great observation. Patrick Rowe, Frank Haug, and then Bob Choate.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Ann actually just covered the topic that I was going to inquire about as well, and I think I agree with kind of both the question and the comment that Ann posed, and I think I also don't consider myself an expert. So one of my other questions was going to be kind of if the Ag Board has weighed in on this proposal and what their comments and feedback are, and if that can be shared with us. But yeah, it certainly sees, I mean, it seems like there's probably common agreement if it's trash, junk, or debris, that's different. But if it is, like how Ann just kind of phrased it, if you're having to screen your work area, I think that's a very different thing. And this is a requirement that would apply to agricultural zone districts where that's kind of the primary intended use. And so yeah, it doesn't seem very thoughtful in my mind.
Frank Haug?
So I'm looking out my window at the 19 llamas in my field right now. And, two things that occurred to me that I just wanted to bring up, and you may have already talked about it, is one, I have about 5 acres of nice irrigated pasture, right? That's different than land in the mountains. And so when you're talking about an animal unit, the amount of land that you can sustain an animal on depends on how much water you've got to that acreage. So I didn't know if that was addressed or not. The second part is I only pasture these animals on my field during the summer. And so I have a period of time when I lease out my field to pasture them. People do that with horses for periods of time. So I didn't know if there was a time limitation or if it was just assumed that everybody had them on there for the entire year. So those were just some questions to think about.
Thank you. Bob Choate.
Thanks. So I was going to go back to the general 3.3.2, and then we're talking about best management practices, and there was a question there about policy discussion about whether there should be more general standards or are there other general standards that should be applied, and I think that the discussion that we were just having is a good example of how a general best management practice is not something that you can reasonably put into regulatory form, saying you can't pile up refuse more than 6 feet. You must comply with the rubbish ordinance. You know, things like that. Those are like enforceable, understandable, objectively applied operational standards. When you say instead, man, I've already lost it there. You say instead, you know, all ag uses, you know, shall use appropriate best management practices to address these things. That sounds like an intent statement. I just don't see how you would like actually apply that. And I think that the discussions we were just having about, you know, screening, you know, outdoor storage of equipment and other materials is a good reason, is a good example of how we should get rid of the general BMP statement, and we should have operational standards that are things that we can look at and have the Ag Advisory Board chime in on. And that's my take on that. And, you know, the second example relates to site drainage. You know, shall prevent water and fertilizer from draining onto adjacent property that is not part of the contiguous land in the agricultural use. You know, that says water and fertilizer. I mean, that's basically saying that I don't have the right you know me where I live, I don't have an ag operation, but if I have an ag operation, that I no longer have the right to drain stormwater off my property to the neighbor's property in the same manner and historic quantity. That really changes it. And I think that, you know, that's a good example of why we need to have operational standards that are well thought out and specific, and not rely on best management practices that are more general in nature.
Commissioner Barnett.
Thank you. To get back to what Mr. Haug was talking about in terms of the amount of water, typically the animal units on unirrigated land are up to 50 acres per animal unit for animals that are on grazing. The kind of standards we've got here imply irrigated land and also supplemental feeding. And I'm not sure quite how to address that, and it may not fit in a code, but somehow or other, those issues have to be addressed. Similar to what Mr. Choate was talking about, writing a code requiring best management practices is difficult, but we sort of all know what good land use management looks like, and also what poor land use management looks like. But I don't want to see us necessarily relying on things have gotten really bad, therefore we have to do something. It's far easier to address things long before they go bad. Part of this ends up being, you know, the responsibility of the extension service and education functions. But so I think I'm left with a lot of questions here.
If I could just really quickly, I think Commissioner Barnett raised something in my head. A feed yard and those things that are intended for supplemental feeding and have activities associated with the density of the animal and stuff still apply. And so some of those numbers, if you're containing your animals to a certain area and supplementing their feed at a certain rate and doing stuff like that, and you exceed the minimum limitations, would kick you into becoming a feed yard, and you'd have to go through the special review process. I think the idea behind some of these standards was to look in generally at just in the agricultural environment, when you have small farms and urban farms and other farms in larger areas, to allow the flexibility in the number of animals based upon the farmer's expectation or the ag user's expectation of the use of their property. Do they have water available? Are they able to rotate the animals on a regular basis to keep from overgrazing the land? Are they going to do supplemental feed? Where do they get that from? Some of the things that go into that. And then to make sure that if that where new ag is going may be adjacent to existing housing developments or whatnot, or more in the urban area environment, that we can have some standards that would help us to direct those operations to be cognizant of the surrounding area and whatnot. And so I agree 100% with what was said on stormwater drainage, for instance. Stormwater drainage, you can't prohibit somebody from allowing their stormwater drainage to move onto an adjacent property. But if you have an area where you're keeping your piles, your compost piles or something, and that creates a puddle of water, you certainly don't want that to all of a sudden be moved onto somebody else's property, because that can cause an impact to them. So where do you draw the line with these standards? We're looking for some helpful tools because we don't have any of these tools that regulate to us at this point. And not that we have a bunch of agricultural uses out there, but on occasion, we get a call, there's this problem, there's this and that, and we don't really have tools to go out and work with those people other than, as Commissioner Barnett said, to maybe point them to cooperative extension services for some educational information. And with that, Commissioner Wallace and then Commissioner Barrick.
I just observed that I think that the idea of the best management practices is probably a really good idea. I know a few years ago we had a dispute about where an irrigation ditch or an irrigation structure should go, and there were some best management practices developed that were then made available to all of the people who were impacted by that and by future people. My objection to the operational standards is you can look at each one of them and see some problem with it. For example, compost pile. Well, Greg Schreiner uses great big huge compost piles that are much deeper than 6 feet in order to store the chicken manure that he's about to put on a field. And we all have people who farm, all have equipment, and it's all lined up somewhere, and sometimes it's close to a property line. And the same thing is true with your drainage. I mean, the best management practices, you don't want your manure and you don't want your fertilizer draining onto adjacent properties. But sometimes if people take that as to the extent that they can, they'll say, well, you can't put any irrigation water can't come onto my property. Well, that's obviously not, it's really, it's not, you can't do that. So I think these things have to be used to, I mean, I do like the best management practices. I have a problem with the operational standards because there's always something that can come up that says, this is not going to work. How do you put a compost area that's enclosed at ground level in order to be rodent resistant? I mean, anybody who lives out where we do know that there's voles and there's groundhogs and there's all kinds of things out there that make that it makes it really tough. So I'm not sure about this whole thing about if you can make them, if you don't have to, if you can make them more not standards as in mandatory, but standards as in things that people can look at, which is of course, then it goes to your best management practices. I understand the need for some of these things and I understand why the county wants to do them, but if you start making them, they shall do or they cannot do or those kinds of things, then you're going to be looking around the county and seeing things that are not in compliance with these operational standards all over the place.
Great points. Great points. Jordana, Commissioner Barrick.
Thank you, Matt. And thank you for your perspective and comments. And Commissioner Barnett, I'm going to go back to the conversation that you guys were having. One of the things that I think about is the increasing percent of ag lands that are being purchased by other municipalities and water providers, especially irrigated lands. And a big part of development and their water strategy is removing the water from those lands. And so Matt, to go to your comment on what are the tools that we need to think about now in order to help manage land properly, what happens if you have irrigated ag with animals on it that then no longer has water on it? then how do you handle the management of those changes? Just putting my thoughts out there.
These are all, I don't see any other hands up at this point, but these are all good points. And I think to this point, we have not had any best management practices in our code or operational standards with ag. We've been kind of hands off. And really agricultural, farming operations and that even those that have the keeping of animals, there is no process for those to actually come through and get approval for us by. And so it may be that we need to talk about whether or not these are in the code or whether or not these are like the animal unit regulations where they're just a tool that is put together for staff or cooperative extension services or others to help mitigate issues when they come up, and they're not just embroidered into the code, because we don't want to regulate agricultural uses like we do other things at this point, and we don't unless they're a feedlot or something that's a rather intensive use. And so maybe this just isn't the place to put them, or maybe we need to think harder about how to put them into the code as it relates to new ag uses. But even a new ag use doesn't really require that you go through a process for approval. So there's no way for us to apply the standard anyways. So food for thought there. Any other comments? All right, I think we got kind of the gist of this when we were talking about that. Was there any more comments on poultry? I know that was the initial part of the conversation and started up, and maybe you guys have a few more questions on that. If not, I think that we can move forward tonight and start talking about 1041 regulations and then wrap this meeting up a little bit early. All right. Good. Thank you, everyone. Matt and Gabby, I'm going to turn it over to you guys and Leslie to talk about 1041 regulations.
Just have to figure out how to stop sharing, and then I'll let Elizabeth take it away. Second.
And Elizabeth, sorry, Elizabeth.
Okay.
You're on another screen.
I was enjoying the chicken conversation. We can switch gears to 1041s if you guys really want to. Leslie, did you want to do any introduction?
No, I will just hand it right off to you, Elizabeth. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. Good evening, everybody. We are talking about discussion draft 2 of the 1041 regulations. So you guys started the party without me, but I was happy to join. And I'm going to share first a PowerPoint that we put together that has an overview of the changes to the 1041 process. And then we can go through the draft if that's your pleasure. And we can certainly go through it top to bottom and talk about the things that are in there. So let me see if technology is going to be my friend tonight. Maybe. Share screen. That's a good command. Let's try this one. Can everybody see the PowerPoint? All right. Let me see if I can change the PowerPoint. There we go. Okay. So what's happened so far? Everybody here probably is aware that there was early input by the Board of County Commissioners and the Planning Commission. There is a dedicated web page to the 1041 update process. And the there was, it's permitting and designation blended together. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But so on the webpage, there's a comparative analysis of peer counties that staff put together early in the process to start thinking about the changes that the county might want to make to these regulations. There are a number of examples from other counties, regulations, 1041 regulations from other counties, and then discussion drafts 1 and 2 of the updated regulations. Because it's 2021 and you guys are all tech savvy, there are videos on the website from the county YouTube channel. And so the June 9th Planning Commission Board of County Commissioners work session is up there, and the June 10th virtual open house. So everybody can get as up to date as they want to be on this topic. Okay, so this is just a clip from the comparison analysis that's in the file. If you are curious about where Larimer County is in terms of what is covered in the 1041 designations and permitting process compared to Arapahoe, Boulder, Eagle Route, and Summit counties, that information is included in this areas and activities analysis on the webpage. This is a great starting point to understand some of the complexity of regulating in this area, and then also sort of where Larimer County was and where we are going with these regulations. So what's coming up next, just to orient everybody to the process, you have this great graphic on the website. Shows us where we are in August. We are in the joint work session on August 11th on the bottom of the timeline. We have a draft up and open for comment. We will be holding a virtual public open house on August 25th on the second discussion draft. We will take comments tonight. We'll take comments in a couple weeks. We will move into any cleanup drafting that we need to do. And then through October, we'll post the public review draft and start into the hearing process with the idea that the new regulations will take effect in November. So just a refresher, what are 1041 powers? So county has zoning authority from a different part of the Colorado statutes, and you have authority to regulate under these 1041 powers, which are named that because when they were adopted in 1974, the bill number was House Bill 74-1041. And so it gathered this common name of 1041, and that's kind of stuck with it. It doesn't actually reflect where this information is codified in Colorado statutes, but the goal of this new enactment was to give local governments a broader set of power to identify, designate, and regulate areas and activities. And those are key words in this process. We designate everything as either an area or an activity of state interest, and then maintain some local control over permitting things that trigger either of these areas or activities. So as we go through this evening and sort of talk about where the regulations are and where they're going, we're going to stick to the words areas and activities. When they're rolled together in the draft and in the statute, they're called matters of state interest. So we speak formally about these things. They're matters of state interest. So what does Larimer County regulate locally? In 2008, the Board of County Commissioners adopted local regulations in Article 10, areas and activities of state interest that are consistent with the statutory requirements. These the 1041 regulations tend to read a lot like the statute, so you can go back and forth and see where the language came from. And the 1041 regulations in Larimer County apply to two things. They apply to designating areas or activities of state interest. So that's the action that the Board of County Commissioners takes to say this is an area or an activity. And then separately, in regulating any development that would take place within an area or across or somehow related to an activity. So it's one procedure, but there are two things going on in it. There have been some amendments over the years in the county's regulations. In December 2009, domestic water and sewer transmission lines, I believe, were added. In 2010, solar energy power plant added. 2015, some formatting changes to the IGA section, and 2020, the removal of the IGA section. So we're going to actually touch on a few of these again. So these are topics that evolve, and let's make sure that the county's in the place where they want to be with these regulations. So moving from discussion draft 1 to discussion draft 2, I'm going to give you a really high level summary of the changes that you'll see in draft 2. If everyone remembers back to draft 1, a lot of the conversation there was an initial discussion about what's everybody's thought, where should we go with this? Staff made a number of suggestions and you guys gave input. And so the goal of this discussion draft 2 is to take the place where you wanted to land and move the draft there. So we've added a lot of content, we've cleaned up language, and it has more going on in it than draft 1 did, because that was the goal. It was first a conversation and then really a draft. So in this draft, you'll see that it includes expanded purpose and intent statements in keeping with so much of the land use code drafting in the county. It's tied back to the comprehensive plan and a number of important goals about development in Laramie County. The new draft clarifies that the 1041 process is applicable even if the project doesn't specifically serve Larimer County. There was a concern that projects that cross through the county should still be subject to county review. So we've clarified that that is the case. It includes amendment and expansion of specific activities and areas. We'll talk about that in a couple slides. Also includes expanded review criteria and submission requirements broken out by specific activity or area. So there are general submission requirements and general review criteria. And then if you were doing something like a major expansion of a nuclear power plant, you might have specific review criteria and specific submission requirements. In this draft, there have been a few clarifications to what is exempt from requiring a 1041 permit or what is not considered included in the 1041 designation. It also includes complete processes for designation and permit review. The older draft wasn't necessarily incomplete. It just didn't take the approach that you're taking now in the new land use code and saying we're going to do this step, and this step. So this draft is lined up with the way the land use code is drafted in terms of procedures. In terms of content, one of the biggest discussions that we've had internally with staff and the consultant team is distinguishing land use code Article 4 review from 1041 review. And because Article 4 includes review of a variety of aspects that could be triggered in a 1041 review. And so we have made an effort to clarify the area and activity size and boundaries relative to the project that would distinguish whether it's an Article 4 review under your existing land use code or a 1041 review under the 1041 process. And then the other trigger criteria is the project size. And I'm going to come back and I'm going to say that in a little less planning jargon. Some things you're going to regulate really well through Article 4. You have good standards there, and the project is of a size and in a location that subjecting it to 1041 review isn't really going to add anything to the county's outcome in the process. And so leaving it in Article 4 review will still give you the same protections in terms of development within the county. Some projects are bigger or they interact differently with an area or activity of state interest, and moving those projects into a 1041 review will allow that really detailed, really robust review of, hey, what do you think you're doing with this project? Because we need to have a very nth degree discussion about it. So we are trying to make the most of the Article 4 regulations that are in place and the 1041 review process to ensure that projects are funneled into the right type of review. Okay, series of technical edits within this draft. This draft addresses later added and related applications for things that have already been permitted through the 1041 process or have been exempted from the 1041 process. So if you do something and then you want to add on to it, or you're doing something related to that project, we have a clear way to move through figuring out whether or not 1041 review is applicable. Technical edit to clarify the relationship to the county's location and extent review. There's a little overlap there. So we wanted to make sure that was clear about if a project has gone through location and extent, what does that mean for 1041? Edit to clarify when the county can make a new designation. The county's always had the power to make a new designation. We just specify within the regulations, the county can make new designations as they see fit. We have specified the applicability of the other provisions of the land use code. So if you've gone through the 1041 process, that doesn't necessarily exempt you from other things in the code related to other aspects of your project. And we tried to be clear about that. We clarified that when there are federal or state application materials that are on 1041 related topics, that the county can rely on those materials if they see fit. We have established a 1041 applicability review at a pre-app meeting. So when somebody comes in, staff is going to take a look at their application, and whether or not the applicant has said, I think I qualify for 1041 or I do not qualify for 1041. One of the standard review questions is going to be, should this project be subject to a 1041 review? We've clarified that the appeal process that's within the existing code is limited to that determination. So if somebody comes in with an application and staff says you have to do a 1041 permit application, that applicant can immediately appeal that determination. And then as we redrafted, we linked the 1041 processes to Land Use Code Section 6.3 Common Review Procedures. I think that's the whole list. That's the whole list. I am not going to stop for questions at the moment because we're going to get the draft up in a little bit and that might answer questions. So let's hold. I won't spend a lot of time on the rest of the slides. We'll just kind of orient ourselves to the big picture questions and then we'll get into the draft. Okay, so what is currently designated? So what has the county said in the past? Hey, this is an area or an activity of state interest. So it's the matters list that tells you its areas and activities. Actually, just about everything in the current list, I think, is an activity. So currently, electric power plants, 50 megawatts or larger, or development or expansion of that, conversion of an existing power plant, a nuclear power plant, a wind power plant with 3+ towers, electrical transmission lines and appurtenant facilities at 69,000 volts or more, existing transmission line upgrades that include expansions of right-of-way or increases in height by 10 feet or more, electrical substations of 69,000 volts or more, new pipelines for natural gas or petroleum transmission that are 10 inches or more. We are going to be taking that out because that will be regulated by the new oil and gas regulations. New or expanded storage facilities of 50,000 cubic feet or more, or 35,000 barrels or more of petroleum derivatives will also be coming out, will be regulated by the oil and gas regulations. New or extended domestic water or sewer transmission lines. We are recommending changes to that section based on conversations that y'all had earlier. So we'll get to those in a second here. New water storage, reservoir or expansion at 50 acres or more for human consumption or appurtenant uses. New or extended domestic water or sewer transmission lines, that depends on the easement size, and solar energy power plant. And so the first question that we come to here, I think there was earlier discussion about potentially removing the designation for solar energy power plant. Do we want to have that discussion now, or do we want to wait until the end of the PowerPoint?
I think you can go ahead and have it now, and then we'll just have one large general conversation.
So this conversation came up before I joined the rewrite of the 1041 regulations. So I would wonder if it would be coming out because it's either not happening, the technology is changing, or it's covered by other designations. But if there is anyone that wants to bring us all up to speed on how we decided to rethink solar energy we can come to a decision about whether to leave it on the list or take it off the list as we do the amendments to this section. Anybody remember the basis of that conversation?
Elizabeth, I don't think this group has actually had a conversation about it. This section was added later to our 1041 regulations. And since that time, I think there's been more interest in potentially, encouraging some of these types of projects. So I flagged this as something that we may want to have some discussion about, just in that, is this still our goal today? Or is this something that now with newer technology and new conversations, we may want to take a fresh look at it, and perhaps the threshold is different, or maybe the standards is a little bit different around this. So we haven't really had discussion about it as a group. So I think we'd be interested in perspectives, and I see a couple hands raised.
Thanks so much, Leslie.
Commissioner Choate, and then Commissioner Steffens.
So my thought on here is that two things. One, 5 acres is very, very small and has very little impact compared to larger solar facilities. So, I think that if you're going to keep it, there should be a discussion about what is the appropriate size, because 5 acres is a corner, on a farmer's field, the non-irrigated section, and as an example. And broader is you shouldn't take away review or add review just to make it easier or harder for a certain use to go in, respectively. You should make the review necessary depending on its potential impacts. And a 5-acre solar facility doesn't have much impact compared to a lot of other uses, but an 1,800-acre solar facility, which is the kind of thing that we're probably going to see in the very near future, it has substantial impacts. So I think solar facility could remain on the list. It could go, but if it does remain on the list, it should be increased in size before you have to go through the 1041.
Commissioner Steffens.
Thanks. Yeah, I agree with Bob. I think that a 5 acre seems like a small amount. And so I'm not sure what the right number of acreage is, but I feel like that doesn't kind of rise to the level of a 1041 type decision. So I don't know if we could look at what other, the size of that other folks are regulating, or we feel like under Article 4, there's, I know that there are other regulations that, are in effect. So it's not necessarily that we're favoring solar power, although, I think with our climate action plan and some of our goals, strategic goals, we're really trying to cut greenhouse gas emissions and look at renewables. But yeah, 5 acres seems like a minuscule amount. And as we see an increase in solar activity, and it just seems like we would be probably looking at things almost every other week at some point, as we see that solar, as we see renewables sort of increase. So I think that I'll leave it to you guys to come up with the number that we feel like is worthy of a 1041, but I don't think 5 acres is.
Commissioner Barnett, and then Commissioner Shattuck McNally.
For other power plants, we, in the draft regulations, we have 50 megawatts as the threshold. I guess I would have a question about how many acres of solar arrays are needed for a 50 megawatt solar installation. But in terms of scale, that might be what we should be thinking about. Partly it's the array itself, but it's also the support facilities and the transmission necessary to put that power into the grid that are the issues that we ought to be looking at, not just the array itself.
300 acres or thereabouts for 50 megawatts.
I think I'd be comfortable with that as a threshold.
I think one of the things I would toss into this conversation is that the provision of solar energy is the technology is changing the fastest of all of the energy types right now. And so I think that you guys are circling the right question. I'm not sure if we're going to answer it tonight because we may want to back up and we may want to measure based on output. We may want to figure out if we want to approach this in a tiered way. So there's a larger solar that triggers 1041 because of the generation capacity, but there might be something smaller that you guys want to go straight through because it's supporting clean energy and climate action and a variety of other things. So I think the regulating technology, and that's what makes 1041 so much fun because we're regulating things that change constantly. This is something that you guys are raising really good points about. So if we don't land on an answer tonight, that's okay. We can come back with some more information for you.
Commissioner Shattuck McNally.
Thanks, Matt. I am glad that Planning Commissioner John Burnett brought up that question, and thank you. I don't remember which consultant brought up that question comment afterwards, but I kind of echoing those comments. I do know what 5 acres kind of looks like because I live around acreage parcels, and I do agree that it's not only the arrays, but all the equipment that's associated with that. And so there's a couple things I'd like to say is it's not only the array and how many panels and things, but maybe not the acreage size, but the equipment going in and out. And also like to look at the co-locate usage, because I know there's some farmers who are looking to co-locate solar panels with their agriculture. And I know that's kind of up and coming. And so I think we should also add that and look at that, add that like the tiered response so that let's say you have you're farming underneath the solar panels, what does that look like? And let's say they cover their whole property with solar panels and also growing spinach underneath. It's kind of something we might need to look at and get kind of way ahead of. But I do think that we have to have something in there for property owners like me that maybe next door, my neighbor does have 5 acres, and let's just say they decide to turn their whole field into solar panels, you know, that would be great for our climate action goals, but also I'd like to make sure that you know, the properties around can say, well, I don't want this right up against my property line or those kind of setbacks and things. So maybe there is a tiered response or some other things in land use code, because I do think we'll see a lot of these smaller solar fields popping up in a lot of locations. Thanks.
Commissioner Kafalis.
Thank you, Matt. My 2 cents, excuse me, my 2 cents here is that regarding the metrics, the 5 acres plus, I think it makes sense to really look at that carefully. And it may be that we want to consider the output of the proposed project, you know, in terms of megawatts versus acreage. So that's just one thought. And also recently at our last administrative matters meeting on Tuesday, we had a presentation during the commissioner's guest portion, a local company, and they were talking about their experience with the city of Fort Collins, and they put in a 200 kilowatt array, solar array on private land at as part of a subdivision out on the east side of town. And the co-founder, the presenter, said it took about 3 years to get that done through the various processes. So my hope is that these smaller projects that don't meet the threshold of requiring a 1041 permit application, that we can somehow address that. And also, again, my takeaway is on this number 13, that we look at what is the proper metric. And we may want to, I would also suggest that we contact the, if it hasn't already been done by Leslie or Matt, the statewide association, the Colorado Solar Energy Industry Association, COSIA. I imagine they would have some good input on what makes sense for these larger projects and incorporating 1041 review criteria, et cetera. Thank you.
Commissioner Doherty.
I'll make it quick. I'm surprised we had so many deficiencies in our 10 hours from before. But just coming back to and hoping for when we look at these items, I want us to remember that 1041 powers are for large items. These are not personal items. I do think the 5 acres is way too small. I do agree with Commissioner Barnett's thought process and whether or not that number is actually the number we go with. But I think that the 1041 needs to be kept for items that are large enough to affect many, many, many people in our community, or much land mass or ecology or environment, et cetera, of the community. So that's just my only 2 cents really on this. Thank you.
Not seeing any more hands pop up. Oh, there's Commissioner Ann Johnson, please.
Thank you. I would like to echo what others have said. We don't want to discourage small scale installations of solar gardens, things that are going to benefit a very small use, such as an environmental learning center or something like that in the county. So we need to be very careful with what is going to require that 1041 application, because it is a very significant application process. It's very detailed. Sometimes faced with a 1041 application process as the only way, a good benefit project may go elsewhere. So I do want to echo, we just have to be very careful with what is going to be required to go through that process, so that we don't shut down an opportunity for something small that has a very good public benefit.
Great observations. Just a quick add-on. I looked while you guys were all talking, and we have several instances in the urbanized area around Fort Collins and down towards Loveland, where we have had a couple of larger facilities. One's over on CSU's campus towards Vine Drive, and it's relatively large. It's closer to 50 acres, but it grew in increments along the way. So it started relatively small at a size, and then it grew larger. We do have one 3-acre one that's located right north of the north end of Fort Collins, and not that those are anything large or disturbing, but I would keep in mind that context plays a very important role here. A 5-acre solar panel field that's just all solar panels sitting in context of a neighborhood in an urbanized area or surrounded by neighborhoods in an urban area might seem a little bit more obtrusive than 5 acres on a guy's corner pivot out in the middle of the farm fields by Rawhide, where we have large areas of land where you can put those and it's not very disturbing. So I think that those were conversations I recall occurring during the time when we adopted that section of the land use code for 1041. Commissioner Barnett.
My thoughts on this are that, we were talking about 1041 regulations, and some number around 50 megawatts or 300 acres or something like that seems to me to be appropriate for a 1041 application. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be looking at smaller scale plants through some sort of a special review or administrative special review or site planning process, so that we get adequate buffering if somebody is proposing a 5-acre installation in a neighborhood. But I think the impacts of those types of installations don't justify the level of review and the kind of information that we're going to require for a 1041 application.
I think everyone is kind of circling some consistent comments here. So we should be able to make changes in the regulation to accommodate the view of there might be something big enough that triggers 1041, and there may be other things that just don't rise to that threshold. Okay, so it's okay if we move forward? Has everyone weighed in on this one? Okay, all right, forward we go. So we have made some edits in the activities section to account for the new oil and gas regulations, and then also to clarify some of what's going on with water transmission line extensions. So the edits that I'm showing you here, H and what was I, those are edits just to those two activities to reflect that the county has now addressed this in Article 11 oil and gas. And the edits that you see to what became letter I, site selection and development of new or extended domestic water or sewer transmission lines. The issue here was, again, this threshold issue that the county wanted to not capture everything, not capture the smaller extensions or service with a provider within the county, but did want to be able to take a look at proposed extensions that are for a larger area, that are going to be moving water out of the county, out of a watershed that's partially or wholly within the county, water serving another municipality or users not located in the county. Water transmission lines that the county hasn't had a chance to look at before in approved water district plans. And any line that might fall into water or sewer transmission line that might not be otherwise regulated within the land use code. So there was a belief that there could be changes to this to not make it as generally applicable, but to really make it specifically applicable to the bigger things that are relevant to the 1041 regulations. And I don't know where everybody is in their line by line edit reading of this. I hadn't planned on stopping here for a specific conversation, but I do want to check in and turn around and see if anyone wants to say anything on these two topics, and particularly the water and sewer transmission lines before we move on to the next slide, where we're going to talk about adding some activities and areas.
Commissioner Cho.
Yeah, I'm going to bring up the, this whole idea of we're going to subject to higher level of review a water transmission line that takes water out of the county. I think that that's really, in my opinion, pushing the boundaries of zoning authority. I understand why that we're talking about that, but to subject a project to a greater level of review simply because it takes water out of the county versus it takes water out of the watershed and uses it for homes in the county, I don't know that we have a zoning interest in that. So I think it would be more appropriate to say if it takes a lot of water out of, away from our watershed for municipal purposes or something like that. I just, this definitely feels like it's very targeted towards a particular development and a type of development because it's going to happen again. And I just want to say that. Otherwise, I think, it has an interest, we have an interest in those things. It has a countywide impact. It's just, we're basically treating we want to keep it in the county for municipal purposes and not go outside of the county for municipal purposes. And it just doesn't seem like an appropriate use of zoning authority.
And Commissioner Choate, just real quickly on that, if you look at item number 3 under I, it says the design of which was not included in an approved water district's plan. So just as an example, let's say that Severance had an approved water district plan, and that water district plan had a plan that shown on their plan that they drew water out of the county to go to that, which then they would have to have that, I think it's 208 plan approved by the county. Then of course we would know, and that would be part of the plan, and we wouldn't subject them to that process. I think the idea was when you start crossing boundaries and whatnot, who's doing what. So I don't think
That's not what it says. It says any of the following. So if it's intended to be, you know, unless it misses these, maybe needs to be cleaned up.
Okay, good point. Commissioner Doherty and then Commissioner Shattuck McNally.
Just to tag along with Commissioner Choate's comments, I can't see what a difference would be on a water line that would cross Larimer County from a water line that would begin in Larimer County. Water is private property, and I believe if we're trying to use zoning to regulate private property, we're opening a can of worms, and I'm very much against this.
Commissioner Shattuck McNally.
Thank you, Matt. With all due respect to Planning Commissioner Sean Doherty and Planning Commissioner Bob Choate, I disagree with your assessment. We're not trying to target anything. We're just trying to strengthen these 1041s to make sure that we're protecting folks from this kind of project and making sure that we're taking in consideration the disruption. So I just want to make my 2 cents clear that I kind of disagree with your comments, and I appreciate you making them, and I'm listening to that, but I tend to think that, you know, this is an opportunity for us to look at these and make sure we're thinking way farther into the future. So thank you.
Commissioner Doherty.
Just as a rebuttal, Commissioner Shattuck McNally, if an application came in from the city of Cheyenne to construct a water line from Cheyenne through Larimer County to a municipality south of Larimer County, is that different than a water line that begins in Larimer County? I do completely understand mitigating any damages to any bordering properties or any properties that this may go through, but I can't see where the difference would be between those two types of applications.
Commissioner Burnett.
One of the issues here is water rights are in fact private property rights. If we are treating a water entity within Larimer County materially differently than we are treating one outside of Larimer County, I think we may run into problems. The question would be, is that facility, is that pipeline part of an adopted plan where it has gone through processes in Larimer County? Is it part of a utility district's master plan? Is it part of the 208 regional plan? That's one reason to treat it one way. If we're treating all pipelines that go through Larimer County the same, so that if somebody was building a water pipeline from Cheyenne to Boulder, and we are treating all pipelines that go through Larimer County the same way, then it's appropriate probably to regulate that one, but it's being regulated not necessarily as a water pipeline, but as a pipeline that has impact on our roadways and rights of way and neighborhoods. So we have to be really careful about how we go about this.
Great observation, Commissioner Shattuck McNally.
Thank you, Planning Commissioner Barnett, for those comments. And I agree with a lot of your thoughts. And I do think we are trying to be careful with this. And I look forward to further discussion on this. But I don't know if we can treat every pipeline the same, because when I think about gathering and flow lines, which are not currently regulated throughout the county, that has a different set of risks and circumstances. And also, you know, I don't think we can treat every pipeline the same. I think that, you know, we have to have those differences. I know we're kind of addressing that in the oil and gas regulations, but I do want to make sure that I do think that these pipelines have to be kind of looked at in a differentiated approach a little bit. And so I want to kind of keep that in mind, that some of those pipelines have a greater risk that we'd like to make sure that we're providing protections for.
Commissioner Barrick, followed by Commissioner Stevens.
Yeah, I don't know the proper legal way to frame this the way some of you do, but when I think about land use code and our comp plan and how it helps create a big picture vision, with 1041, what I worry about is we have to look at each project one by one. And if you have multiple projects that are kind of doing the same thing within our county, how are we able to protect certain resources if we only get to make decisions on one project alone? And so I appreciate having something in our land use code that allows us to at least be part of the conversation. So whether we can legally, yes, water is a private property and we can't say what they can or can't do with it when it moves through our county, but how can we be a part of the process? How can we, you know, and I think about these 1041 projects and how a lot of them are 20 or 30 years in the development by the time they even come to our hearing. And so how do we write a land use code that allows us to be a partner in a project that we can look out for the good of our county's values while also trying to achieve a project, whether it's in our county or not. And so I like where you've gone with a lot of the general considerations, and I know we'll get into that, but I just like being able to include something that allows us to be a part of the conversation for some of these projects.
Thank you. Commissioner Stevens and then Commissioner Cho.
Yeah, I don't know if Frank wants to weigh in or something, but I was kind of concerned about, you know, could we be that specific in pointing out a certain kind of, you know, pipeline, you know, I don't know if that, you know, if we shouldn't just, you know, I think that these sort of major pipelines that kind of, you know, go across multiple areas of the county are disruptive no matter who's getting the water, and they should be subject to some review. But I don't know that I don't know how, if, you know, if we have the right to kind of distinguish between water being removed from our county or not. You know, that's kind of subject to, I think, the water courts and water law more than, so I don't know if this is problematic. It feels like it could be. And I just, yeah, I think that, you know, I think being specific could look like we're targeting a particular project, and that's not my intention here. My intention is to review big projects in our county that could be disruptive to, you know, both people and our environment. I do think that, you know, we have a lot of environmental protections written into the 1041. So I would be okay, you know, being less specific in this regard, especially if it's at all problematic from a legal perspective.
Good observations. And I would say, think about electrical transmission lines. We do regulate high-powered transmission lines versus just your regular electrical lines. So there are times when we regulate something that appears to be the same but has different impacts. So I think it's important to identify what the impacts are with each of these types of. Commissioner Cho.
I want to say I agree 100% with Commissioner Stevens. What we have is, I think that if there's enough water being moved out of our watersheds, there's a substantial impact that we can reasonably take into consideration with a 1041 review. I just think that just being fair, do we really care or have a good leg to stand on to say, well, we care because it's leaving our constituents and our community. The impact is the same regardless. And so I would suggest that it just be, maybe it could be like Matt said about, we regulate high power electric transmission lines. Maybe we can identify it more based on the amount of water being moved or the size of the pipeline or something like that. Or it's going to be taken from natural watershed or ag uses, and a certain amount is going to be converted to municipal use. I mean, these are real issues that we're going to be dealing with for the rest of my lifetime and a lot longer after that. And I just think that, I'm not here to say, I'll leave it to Frank to say whether there's liability there. I'm just saying what we're looking at is zoning, in impacts, and it doesn't change whether that water goes across the county line or not. So I agree with you, Commissioner Stevens, 100%.
Thank you, Commissioner Cho. And I want to remind everybody of another project. Several of you were on the Planning Commission not too long ago when Excel Energy installed a high power or a high pressured gas line from the southern part of the county to the very northern part of Fort Collins. And it crossed numerous jurisdictions and whatnot, and was very, it was something that the closer you got to houses, the more concern there was. It wasn't like putting in your natural gas line to your house, but it was a larger line that was under high pressure, and it was treated under, I believe, under item H or one of the previous ones on that. So sometimes it's the nature of the line. I'm going to let Frank go real quick and respond to Bob's comments, and then Ann Johnson after that.
The only comment I have is that I do think there's a way to do it, but I think you're both right when you say it really depends on the impacts. I mean, what you're trying to regulate is what is the impact to the county. And so that there is some cases and things that talk about county protectionism, meaning you can't really favor necessarily businesses or disfavor settlement or different things in different counties. So we will need to be careful. I'll work with everybody to work on that, but I think those are all really good points.
Commissioner Johnson?
Yes, so I was just going to say be consistent. So we can't be accused of being arbitrary and capricious, and base everything that we're doing on the impact. So it echoes what everybody else said. And I just was feeling quiet, and it's 8:20 and I just had to delay this meeting a little bit longer.
Thanks, Ann. All right. Not seeing anybody really raise their hand real quick right now. I think I'll turn it back over to Elizabeth. Did you want to talk about another subject tonight or continue on?
Thanks, Matt. Let me keep going. We have just a few more discussion things in here, and then the rest of it is sort of what is in the draft itself. And we can decide how deeply we want to go into that. In your initial discussions, there was discussion about proposing 2 new activities of state interest. That is site selection of new arterial highways and interchanges that have not otherwise been planned and reviewed by Larimer County, and site selection of new collector highways that have not otherwise been planned and reviewed by Larimer County. Those are straight from the statute. We also had some thought about, does the county want to designate new communities as an activity for 1041 review? The statute defines new communities as the major revitalization of existing municipalities or the establishment of urbanized growth centers in unincorporated areas. I was sorry, I paused for a second to figure out how I wanted to lead into this. So I think the discussion of new communities falls back on, is this a threshold question. Is this a thing where we would want to say yes, new communities of X size, because they will significantly impact roads and infrastructure? Or is this a situation where the existing regulations outside of 1041 will get the county where it wants to be? So I'm gonna stop for a second. I am not sure where this conversation has happened before, if it has happened before, but this was highlighted in the draft as one of the things that we were thinking about discussing.
Commissioner Stevens.
Okay, so first I'm going to start with the highways and interchanges. I mean, I will say that like most arterial highways, new collector highways, I mean, have been sort of reviewed by us through like the MPO process and state, some of the, I mean, so I don't know if, we want to include those, although I think I might have been the one who said we should include them. I also want to make sure that, I mean, if we feel like, I guess I wouldn't mind, CDOT does a lot of review clearly. And so, especially now with a lot of the greenhouse gas regulations and the policies they have around not social justice, but like environmental justice kind of issues that I think that there's a lot of scrutiny over highway projects and a lot of more thought around that. And like I said, I feel like we do have a chance to review a lot of that through existing mechanisms like the MPO. So I'm on the fence about that. Around new communities, I think we briefly talked about this once, and I think we talked about there being, standards in place in other parts of the land use code that would apply or that give enough scrutiny to new communities that we didn't necessarily need to include it. And looking at the other counties, I mean, I think that there's some good things that folks are looking at. I think walkability and kind of making sure that, but there weren't a lot of criteria that I saw around some of the new communities. So I don't know if that kind of review wouldn't be better in a different part of the land use code and not in the 1041. And so I didn't really answer yes or no on any of those, but I just wanted to provoke some conversation. Thank you.
Very good. Commissioner Johnson, and then Commissioner Doherty, and then Commissioner Choate.
Thank you, Matt, and everybody. Federal money usually comes in with any state highway interchange or location work. There's enough scrutiny that the federal government places on those projects upon CDOT and any other local communities that might be involved. So I don't think that we need to have L&M go through a 1041 process. As for new communities, I don't believe that they need to go through a 1041 process either, because once they are establishing where they might want to be, they've already had to go through a lot of the same type of scrutiny, maybe even the 3 alternative locations before they're even settling on where that new community would be. So I don't think any of these items on the slide would need 1041.
Thank you. Commissioner Doherty, and then Commissioner Choate.
Well, I can agree with that on both of these because I'd have a little less government delaying things. But on the flip side of it, I have another question that might pertain a little bit to this. Matt, you may be able to answer it. If any of these activities, these or any of the previous ones that we thought about came up for an application and the county had no interest in denying or even debating a 1041 on it, is there a way for the commissioners to be able to say, we are not even going to ask for a 1041 hearing on this or application?
There, and Elizabeth can help me with this, but there is an appeal process where if we say they are obligated to be under 1041, they can appeal that determination. But I think if if, for instance, it's a, a regulation that says that if you're going to build a transmission line for an electrical power plant that's over a certain size, you have to come in. That's not really discretionary. I mean, it says you have to come in and do it. So I'm not sure there would be. That doesn't mean, I guess we couldn't write one in, but from a legal standpoint, that's tough, right? Because if you start saying, well, these people I will and these people I won't, it starts to seem, or it becomes more difficult to not have it seem arbitrary, right? If you have some kind of hard line, then you say if it's over 3 miles long or over this many kilowatts or whatever, then you just have to do it. If you say, well, you're over 3 kilowatts, but I don't think it'll be that bad. It's just hard to draw criteria to make that distinction.
Makes sense. Thanks, Frank.
Great observation. Commissioner Cho.
I was thinking about with these, with the highways and roads and arterials and collectors, I agree with the other comments about, well, they do get quite a bit of review. I work with my client to help build those things. And they're many, many years in the making. I'm sure that Larimer also has a capital improvement plan that goes out 5 years or more. They get a lot of review, but what I was thinking is what happens if CDOT comes through and says we're going through your review to get your approval, and then the county says either no or we want you to do this instead, and it's going to cost an extra $2 million. That's a very easy thing that can happen with minor changes depending on when it's reviewed and the how far along the project is. And I just wonder, are we setting ourselves up to get into a big nothing burger fight if someone comes up, a group of neighbors comes up and says we don't want it, and CDOT says, well, it's going to cost $10 million more to do it the way you want, so we're not going to. I just think that maybe we don't need this here in 1041, that we have our elected officials to advocate for our residents in other forums. And then just to provide a comment on the new communities, major revitalization of existing municipalities, there's the establishment of urbanized growth centers. I'm not sure what that looks like, right? Because I think I'm thinking of like Denver Tech Center, right? Which is down in an area that has it's mostly unincorporated. And I don't know exactly what it would look like up here, but realistically, we have very, very limited growth options. Anything that looks anything like that is going to be in the growth management area and probably annexed. So I'm not going to say it's a bad idea. I just don't see what it would apply to.
Thank you. And I would just add one last thing, that I think when we originally started talking about 1041 and when 1041 came into being years and years and years ago, and I find it important that all of these sentences generally start with site selection, and that doesn't really happen much anymore. Most of these projects that you see are site selection has been done or is 80% done before an application hits the road, and there's a lot of money spent. I think the intent way back when 1041 was put together, that was before, let's say, CDOT went out and said, we're going to put a road here. They came to the local community and they said, let's have a discussion through the 1041 process about what would be a good site selection for a road, and then we'll pursue whatever procedures and processes. But all too often these days, our processes don't work quite that neatly. Commissioner Choate.
I agree with you, Matt. The problem is, just look at the regulations as we have them written. At that early stage of the project, the planning, we don't have any of the information. I think about if I were to be putting together one of these applications on behalf of my public entity client, we built a $176 million highway, and it's kind of like, okay, well, we would have none of this information if we had to go through this review at early enough to say, well, this is where the corridor is going, instead of, because, you know, they did have those conversations. Should it be here, or should it be here or here? You know, it's kind of a catch-22.
Commissioner Barnett.
Having participated in a couple of long-range major corridor planning studies with CDOT and Larimer and Weld counties, City of Greeley, City of Evans, City of Loveland, and lots of other entities, I can say that the amount of stakeholder planning and the amount of outreach that CDOT puts into these planning projects is really pretty outstanding. The planning processes go on for years, even where CDOT may not even be the major funder of some of those projects. So it's interesting to watch that process, but in terms of stakeholder involvement and the thoroughness of the planning effort, I'm not sure we actually could get as detailed with a 1041 review of that as they do with their stakeholder involvement and with all of the processes that they go through. So in all honesty, I don't think 1041 can contribute much to a new transportation project when you compare it to what CDOT already does. And that event of, or when looking at new communities, or even the creation of the Fort Collins Tech Center, if you will, if that's in unincorporated Larimer County, the chances are that's going to start out with a major rezoning and dramatic adequate public facilities study and a number of other studies already. I think that we've got the kind of regulatory framework that probably would address the needs of that, as well as 1041. I might be wrong here, but that's kind of what I'm thinking.
Great, all good comments. Thanks, everybody. Elizabeth, is there, oh, Nancy's chiming in real quick, and then I think we'll turn it back over to Elizabeth to get us back on track.
I was just a comment, and that is when we're looking at the bypass at the Highway 14 North 287 bypass, when it, and if it ever gets evaluated, how are we going to have any input into that particular issue? And I know I'm being really site specific, but it's easy to think about it that way. Are we going to have an input into where that's going to go at some point in time through some other process than a 1041?
I would encourage us not to talk about that tonight, as it's got the potential of being a project in the future. But that's a good question, Nancy. What process would we look at such a type of a road? And currently, under current regulations, it would probably go through a location and extent level review. All right. Commissioner Cho?
I'll just point out, I mean, you answered the question correctly, Matt, in that it would probably go through a location and extent. But I think in more aligned with what John said, it's, you know, you've got your MPO, and, you know, you've got all the outreach that CDOT does. And you know, I think that that was John's point, is that we don't have to be the only people looking at that kind of project. The timeline of those projects just necessarily includes a lot of people and a lot of opportunity for comment. It's really a matter of, okay, well, if you put it here, what you're saying is you want to give the county opportunity to kind of command some of the way that goes. And if that seems to be the only, you know, the best reason to include it here. Not that I'm saying that that's a good reason. I'm just saying there's a lot of input opportunity through other means.
Okay. Great comments, guys. Elizabeth?
Yep.
How much more do we got? It's now 8:38. I want to be respectful of you guys' evening. We can go as long as you want, but we got a little bit of work after this. So Elizabeth, how much more do you think?
I have a few more slides, and then in our earlier discussions, we were trying to figure out kind of what we wanted our next steps to be. So why don't we do the last few slides? I don't think I have any discussion issues hiding in these last few slides. And then we can decide what the next, what the path forward is going to look like for this draft, if we don't want to spend the rest of the evening doing line by line review of it.
Okay, the floor is yours.
Okay, so those were activities edits. We are recommending some areas edits. We are recommending adding new designations, new review criteria, and new submission standards for natural hazard areas, and that would be flood hazards outside of the floodplain overlay. For geologic hazard areas, and currently we're having a staff level discussion about how we map geologic hazard areas to properly identify them, what mapping resources are available, because mapping the areas is one of our requirements of the statute. We are proposing 1041 review over natural resource areas, which are two separate areas, critical wildlife habitat, and those are identified on the state wildlife map. And then also potentially areas of visual and recreational significance. And similar to the geological hazard areas, we're talking about how to map areas of visual and recreational significance. So I think we're going to need to come back to you with that information for more detailed discussion about how 1041s would work in these areas, 1041 review. And then finally, areas of historical or archaeological resources. Those are both already mapped on state maps. And so the idea would be to adopt the state map and do 1041 review for projects that triggered the applicability criteria in any of those areas. Moving on. So in the submission requirements and review criteria, which I understand was one of the bigger discussions about where to go with updating the 1041 regulations, we've worked to clarify the review criteria and the submission requirements for all applications. So there were generally applicable review criteria and generally applicable submission requirements. I'm going to stop here and make a comment. The county's current submission requirements for 1041 applications are fairly robust. You are already obtaining a great deal of information about these projects. We have proposed additional area or activity submission information in keeping with the approach that some of your peer counties have taken. And one of our internal steps left to do is ensure that we eliminate overlap between the general application and project-specific applications. So we are bearing in mind that we don't want an applicant to have to duplicate while we still want them to provide enough information for good decision-making. So then along with that, we have updated and proposed new review criteria and submission requirements for the specific areas and activities. So should you decide to keep some of those roadway activities, there's a list of traffic generation and whatever else might be expected to take place with a project like that to ensure that the information is included in the 1041 permit application. And then finally, at close to the end of the draft, you'll see there's a list of general considerations. We found that a number of other counties included these general considerations, and they're useful in terms of framing what a discussion can be around a particular review area in a 1041 permit application. Really what we want is for the applicant to know what the discussion could be, as well as for the decision makers to know what the discussion could be, because then the information as it's presented can be targeted and nobody's surprised by the discussion. Hey, we're going to talk about the economic impact of this, large new community with 500, senior homes that you're putting out here in the middle of the county, we want to understand what it means. So we may or may not keep the general considerations as part of the language in the code, but we thought that they were interesting to include because at the beginning of this discussion about 1041s, the idea was, are we doing things consistently and in a way that we want to do them in the county? So that's to allow for discussion. Additionally, at the end of the draft is the current permit application content. In case you're curious about what somebody has to submit, you can see that what's already being collected. We made a few recommendations, specific recommendations for information that should come in on the general application. So at the end of the body of the draft, we had some kind of continuation requirements. So, hey, you got your permit, what happens next? We clarified the requirement for financial guarantees that the project is going to take place as approved. We specified the term of the permit. So if nothing happens within a specified period of time, the permit expires, there is an opportunity in there to have it extended. But the goal with all permitting is not to have it out there for all eternity for projects that don't proceed. And then there's an administration and enforcement section in there. And so that details what happens if you fail to obtain a permit, if you want to make material changes to your project, if the county decides to suspend or revoke an approval, there could be changes that take place without the applicant talking to the county about it, that may be grounds for suspension or revocation. Can a permit be transferred? Under what circumstances? And what happens when the county needs to inspect the project? And then finally, we included some new and updated definitions that will be rolled into the general definitions section of the land use code. See if that's probably about it. That's it. So that's the large overview. And as Matt pointed out, we're at 8:45. We've had a couple big discussions. And I think I'm going to look to Matt and Leslie to guide kind of where we think we want to go next with this, moving forward into getting public comment on the draft and getting more comment from you guys on the draft.
Thank you, Elizabeth. We do have a time scheduled for some public input around this on August 25th is the date. And so I think what we'll do is see what others have to say. We can share some of this feedback at that meeting as well. And then after that, the goal is to turn another draft around. And if we need another work session, we can certainly schedule that. I think the original intent was to take this and refine it after we have that public feedback and then bring it back to you in October for hearings. And so but we also have the opportunity to come back, I think, in September and have further conversation about it if you'd like to do that too.
Commissioner Johnson?
Hi, thank you. I would like to see things in another work session instead of just going from, gathering more public input. I think that there have been enough questions asked tonight that I would respectfully request that we see it in another work session before going to public hearing.
Commissioner Cho.
I've got a bunch of comments on the draft, but they're not that needs to be discussed here. I'll send them to you all. Just thoughts on a certain, how long is it good for, the county has to approve a transfer and things like that. We don't need to get into it now, but I do think that it's worthy of consideration. And I'm also thoughtful of, we're running out of, we're doing a lot here. And I think it would be good to have another conversation about this in September. I think though that we might need to be talking about housing again, because that was a spirited discussion. And I anticipate that there would be more substantive changes presented based upon that conversation and whatever public input you have. So I don't know if we can fit another 1041 discussion in at the same time that we talk about the housing discussion, which is both are very important.
Thank you. Leslie, I saw your hand go.
Oh, yeah, I was trying to get it up. So the next work session that we have with you all is September 8th. And so I think that would be the best opportunity for both of those topics, probably after we hear some public feedback and after we have a chance to do some adjusting with some of the language in these various sections. So we can tentatively plan for those dates or that date.
Are there any more questions on 1041? It sounds like we exhausted all of you guys talking about it. So if not, I guess we can talk about wrapping up the meeting. But I think before wrapping up the meeting, we wanted to talk a little bit about the schedule for the upcoming month or two, just to make sure that we're all on the same page. It's going to be a busy couple of months.